Thank you, Bill. I'd like to thank the Life Sciences Training Institute for the opportunity to host this webinar today, and a special thanks to those of you who are in the audience, because without you, we would all be wasting our time. So this webinar is on the Pre-Market Approval Pathway, or PMA, ensuring successful regulatory submissions. My name is Dr. Michael Drues. Just a tiny bit about my background. My Ph.D. is in biomedical engineering, although I don't do a lot of engineering per se anymore. I consult for a wide variety of medical companies, not just medical device companies, but drug and biotech companies as well. I also work part-time as a consultant for Health Canada as well as the FDA. And the reason why I point that out is because there are not a lot of folks that can say that can work both on the industry side as well as on the FDA side. So as I hope you'll see even in this very short webinar today, I try to use that to my advantage, because I try to look at a lot of these issues from both sides of that fence. If you're interested in knowing more about me, I would encourage you to visit my LinkedIn page. And certainly invite me to connect with you if you would like to do so. So let's go on and talk a little bit about what we're going to talk about in this webinar. Where does the PMA fit within the medical device universe? There are many different pathways that we can use to get products onto the market, medical devices onto the market in the United States, and the PMA is one of them. Must we choose a single regulatory pathway? A lot of people think that you need to make a choice, either a 510K or a PMA or an HDE or a CDE or a de novo or whatever it is. Must we make a single choice? How does the 510K compare to the PMA? As most in this audience probably know, the 510K is clearly the workhorse of the medical device industry. So how does it compare to the PMA side of the world? And if you don't want to play in the PMA universe, so to speak, how can we get out of it? Are there ways that we could mitigate our risk so that we can get out of a PMA? That's not a major thrust of this particular webinar, but we'll talk about it at least briefly. What types of PMAs exist and how do I choose? As we'll discuss, there are several different subtypes of PMAs, just like there are several different subtypes of 510Ks. And it's important to be able to understand what the different options are so that you can choose the best one given your particular situation. And of course, what are the major components that go into a PMA? As we're going to see, it's a much more robust submission than a typical 510K. And finally, what's new in the PMA world? As some of you in this audience may know, FDA has put out a couple of new guidances just in the last couple of months. I've given a couple of them to you in the handouts and resources section, and at the end of this webinar we'll talk a little bit about those. And then I'll wrap up with some final thoughts, and then we'll try to reserve the last few minutes for any Q&A or discussion that people might have. So just as to get a kind of stake in the ground, I'd like to begin with these couple of questions for the audience. Have you previously worked on a PMA device in the past? Do you currently work on a PMA device right now? And do you anticipate working on a PMA device in the future? If you could just please take a moment and answer those questions. I'd just like to see how the group stands, since I can't see you directly. But let's see how you respond. So the initial responses, it looks like about 2/3 of the group has worked on a previous PMA device in the past, and about 1/3 of you have not. It looks like almost half of you currently work on a PMA device, and a little more than half do not. And finally, 100% of the group anticipates working on a PMA device in the future, and I suspect that's why many of you are in this webinar today. Okay, great. So let's continue on with the presentation. And If you want more information, by the way, I would just point you to this particular article that I just wrote a few weeks ago in the Life Science Training Institute's sister publication, Med Device Online. This article is called FDA's PMA Pathway, Friend or Foe. I believe that was provided to you as part of the supplemental information, so after the webinar is over, you might find it interesting to read through that. It's fairly short, but you might find it interesting. So the first question: where does the PMA fit in the medical device universe? Again, as most of you know, there are a number of different options that we have in bringing medical devices onto the market in the United States. Many more, in fact, than we have in the world of drugs and biologics. There are two primary or more common choices. The first, as I mentioned a moment ago, the Premarket Notification, or PMN, oftentimes referred to as the 510K, which is based on the very nebulous concept of substantial equivalence. And then the second major option, or most common option, I should say, is the Investigational Device Exemption, or IDE, which is followed by the Premarket Approval, or PMA, the subject of this webinar today. Now, these are the two most common options, but they are by no means the only options, and I'll talk more about those in a second. But before I do, I want to talk just a little bit about the IDE. A lot of people have confusion as to when you need or don't need an investigational device exemption, or IDE. So let's start out with a general rule, and that is most 510K medical devices do not require clinical data, but some do. On the flip side, most PMA devices do require clinical data, but some do not. So let me say that one more time. Most 510K devices do not require clinical data, but some do, whereas most PMA devices do require clinical data, but some do not. If you understand that, then you'll understand when we need to file an IDE, because an IDE is necessary whenever we're going to be doing collecting clinical data, human clinical experimentation or clinical trial. So for the vast majority of PMAs, the ones that do require clinical data, you will need to get an IDE first. If you are working on a PMA that does not require clinical data, and granted there are not a lot of them, but there are some, if you're working on a PMA that does not require clinical data, you will not be required to do an IDE. On the flip side, back to the 510K. The vast majority of 510Ks do not require clinical data, therefore you do not need an IDE. However, for the small but growing number of 510Ks that do require clinical data, you will require an IDE. So bottom line, an IDE will be required regardless of regulatory pathway when clinical data is required. Now, informally, the IDE essentially gives you permission, if you will, to begin your clinical trial in the U.S. It's similar to an IND in the drug side of the world. However, legally, that's not really what the IDE gives us. Basically, the IDE gives us, similar to the IND, permission to transport our product across state lines, which sort of begs the question, if you were wanting to do a clinical trial and bring a product onto the market only in one state, would you need an IDE or an IND? I've asked many of my attorney friends, regulatory attorney friends, and nobody seems to know because nobody's ever tried. And of course, nobody, why would anybody ever want to try? Nonetheless, I think it's an interesting question. So I think it's important to rather than just memorizing, we need to understand what is the regulatory logic here. That is much more valuable, in my opinion, than memorizing things. Okay, in terms of the cost of doing business, here's some statistics for you from just a few months ago. The vast majority, in fact, about 90% of medical devices that are brought to market in the United States do not undergo the PMA path. They are the lower risk, so-called Class 1 or even exempt or Class 2 medical devices. But for the devices that we're going to be talking about in this webinar, we're talking about Class 3 devices, the highest risk devices, about 10%, probably a little less actually, than 10% of the devices fit into this particular group. And for those that are interested in classification, that's the subject of a whole different discussion. But next month, I am going to be doing a webinar specifically on the medical device classification system and how to use it more effectively, because I think most people do not really use it well. They do not really understand it, how to use it to their advantage. So I'm going to be doing a webinar through the Life Sciences Training Institute on classification. If you're interested, send me an email. I'll be happy to give you some information about that. But suffice it to say, a lot of people think that classification is, whether in the United States or anywhere else in the world, is simply based on risk, and that's simply not the case. Part of it is risk, but it's a lot more complicated than that. Anyway, when you look at some of the economics, I find this interesting. It costs about $31 million on average to bring a 510K medical device onto the market, as opposed to about $94 million to bring a PMA device. So round numbers, it's about 3 times more expensive to bring a PMA device onto the market as it is a 510K. Everybody knows that. What I think is more interesting is the second part of this statistic. More than 3/4 of those costs are directly related to, as these authors call it, clearing the regulatory requirements. I don't know about anybody else, but I would like to think that we're spending all of this time and money not simply jumping through a bunch of regulatory hoops. I would like to think that there are some reasons, some justifications why we're doing it. I'm not always sure that's the case, but that's what I would like to think. Nonetheless, it costs roughly 3 times more to bring a PMA device onto the market than a 510K. And so for those of you that are working in the PMA world, kudos to you, because you are in a very small minority within the medical device community. The vast majority of companies out there would much prefer, given a choice, to bring a product onto the market under the 510K as opposed to the PMA, for lots of reasons, not the least of which is cost. But cost is certainly a factor. But from a competitive regulatory strategy perspective, and I did a webinar a few months ago on competitive regulatory strategy for the Life Sciences Training Institute, should you be interested. From a competitive regulatory strategy, there could be advantages to doing a PMA as opposed to a 510K, not the least of which is setting that regulatory burden a little higher for those that are coming along and following in your footsteps. Simply put, and again, this is the topic of a different webinar, but I'll mention it just briefly. Most people, when they have heard the phrase competitive regulatory strategy, what that means to them is, how did their competitor get their particular device onto the market before them? And to me, that is not competitive regulatory strategy. That's nothing more than following the leader. To me, competitive regulatory strategy means, let me explain it this way. So anybody can design a regulatory strategy to get a product onto the market. It's very easy to do. The challenge is, how do you design your regulatory strategy not simply to get your product onto the market, but to act as a barrier to entry to your competition? In other words, make it more difficult for your competitors to follow in your footsteps. So in the context of the PMA, if you're in sort of that gray area between, say, Class 2 and Class 3, where you could go either way, it may be tempting for you to argue that your device should be a 510K because it will be easier for you. Well, it will be easier for you, but also, who else would it be easier for? Your competition following your footsteps. So you may, as a matter of a business decision, decide we're going to set the regulatory bar higher and we're going to go the PMA route. We probably could have been successful with a 510K, but we're going to go PMA instead, because it's going to make it more difficult for those coming after us to follow in our footsteps. This is one of several examples of what I call competitive regulatory strategy. Again, that's the subject of a different webinar, and if you're interested, send me an email and we can certainly get you in touch with that. In addition, of course, to the 510K and the PMA, there are a number of other pathways to market. I'm just going to mention them very briefly: the Product Development Protocol, or PDP, the De Novo, As some of you may know, the de novo underwent some significant changes by Congress about 2 years ago, and now is starting to be used much more frequently. I did a webinar for the Life Sciences Training Institute a couple of months ago, specifically on the de novo, should you be interested. But in the past, the de novo has not been used very often. In fact, less than 5 submissions per year. But just in the last 12 months alone, that number has increased by a factor of 3-fold. And I see it increasing even further in the future, especially in 3 technology areas: in vitro diagnostics, and in imaging, and in mobile medical apps. If you're working in any of those 3 areas, there are other areas too, but specifically in vitro diagnostics, which includes companion diagnostics, imaging, and mobile medical apps, I see the de novo as really a desirable pathway to consider for the future. In addition to the de novo, we've got the humanitarian use device, or humanitarian device exemption path. This is kind of similar to the orphan drug program on the drug side of the world. And by the way, this is a topic of a more advanced regulatory strategy discussion, but I love to bring products onto the market when I can under the HDE, and then go on to expand the label later as a PMA. So it's a great example of how I can use these different regulatory paths in combination. You do not have to choose one or another. You can often use them in combination to do some really cool things. And that idea of getting it onto the market as an HDE first and then PMA label expansion second is something that we do in the drug world all the time. We expand labels in the drug world all the time using slightly different methods, but the underlying logic is exactly the same. And so some of my favorite medical device strategies have been stolen directly from the drug world and vice versa. Okay, in addition to that, we have the custom device exemption, or CDE, very not commonly used in the past. However, I think this has the potential to be used a heck of a lot in the future, and here's why. Because this is the closest thing that we have at the moment to fit the technologies that we're developing in personalized medicine for medical devices, including in 3D printing. The CDE is not a perfect pathway for these kinds of technologies, and I think, quite frankly, we need to create a new one. But in the absence of a new one, the CDE is probably the best one that we have, the most appropriate one that we have. So in the past, this has not been used very, very much. As a matter of fact, very little. But in the future, I see it as the potential of growing, and who knows, with personalized medicine, and this is the topic of a different discussion, I actually think that we could have more CDEs in the future than even 510Ks, for reasons I won't get into here. And finally, the emergency or compassionate use situation, which kind of is what the name implies. So bottom line, although some of these pathways are not commonly used, unless you understand all of the different possible pathways that you have available to you and the advantages and disadvantages to each and every one, then how can you possibly decide when to use, or alternatively when to not use, each one? In other words, how can you do your job? And so we need to be aware of all of them, not just the most common ones. Okay, so obviously there are a lot more pathways in the medical device world than there are for drugs, and even within the medical device world, must we take the path that most everybody chooses? Do we need to choose only one? Well, the short answer to that is no. I've already given you a quick example of how I can combine the HDE and the PMA to bring a product onto the market initially pretty quickly and easily, but then expand the label later on to go after a bigger market. Well, here's another example. This is a case study I call Magoo, for those of you that remember the Mr. Magoo cartoon. This particular one is a fictitious case because it's based on an actual medical device that I brought to market a few years ago. But in the spirit of Dragnet, I've had to change the names to protect the innocent. So, in a nutshell, I'll give you a quick example. This is my Magoo regulatory strategy. Oh, and for some reason we're missing a picture here. There's supposed to be a picture of something like the device. It's an injectable medical device. A lot of people think that medical devices cannot be liquids. Absolutely not the case. This is a injectable medical device. You can kind of think about it as a glue, but really, oh, there it is. Thank you. You can kind of think about this as a glue, but it's a reversible glue. We can inject it into a blood vessel, and it will solidify, and it will then stop bleeding, what we call hemostasis. And then when we want to get rid of it, we simply dissolve it with a little cold saline, and it goes away. So this is what we call temporary or reversible homeostasis. So the indication here is for controlling bleeding in vascular surgery. If you're doing a femoral popliteal bypass in the leg, or if you're doing a cabbage in the heart, something like that. So Magoo is not a drug. It's a medical device. And again, why can't medical devices be liquids? They certainly can be. So what's the regulatory pathway? Well, the most obvious, the first choice that most medical device companies would make is we want it to be a 510K because that's the easiest, it's the cheapest, and so on and so on. But what it comes down to, quite frankly, is what you or I think really doesn't matter. It's what we can sell within the regulatory agency, whether it's FDA or somewhere else. So could we sell this as a 510K? It's going to have a certain degree of what I call regulatory risk associated to it. Risk has many different connotations, and one of the connotations of risk that I take into account is what I call regulatory risk. In this context, regulatory risk means what is the risk that I am not successful at FDA in whatever in selling or whatever I'm trying to sell. I don't mean in a literal or an economic sense, but in this particular case, the regulatory strategy. So if I went in with this product and said I should be able to 510K it, it's going to have a fairly significant regulatory risk. On the other hand, if I suggested to the company that we should go the PMA route, I could tell you right now that this particular product would never in a million years be brought to market for one simple reason. When I first got involved with this company, it was a startup. Startup is sort of a fancy way of saying that, it was venture capital funded, there was not a lot of money, and bottom line, if this went the PMA route, it would have never come to market. And so basically, is there a compromise? Is there a way that I can have my cake and eat it too? Well, the answer is absolutely, and this is the way we sold it at FDA. This is an example of what I call an anatomical location-specific regulatory pathway. This is very uncommon in the medical device world. An anatomical location-specific regulatory pathway. In a nutshell, here's what I mean. For peripheral vascular applications, like, for example, a FemPop bypass in the leg, we're going to argue that this should be a 510K because it's very easy to mitigate the risk associated with to the patient in terms of complications and so on and so on. I won't get into the details about how we can do it, but suffice it to say it's very easy to do. But even before anybody gets a chance to ask the question, well, what about when people start using this in the coronary? I'm going to set the bar higher, and I'm going to say for coronary applications, we're going to go the PMA route. So I have purposely set the regulatory bar higher in order to mitigate that risk, or more appropriately, in order to sell this regulatory strategy at FDA. And right away, that's going to, in the eyes of the reviewers in the room, put me in a very good light, because they're going to say, oh, that Mike guy, he's a good guy because he's acknowledging that in the coronaries it's higher risk, therefore we're going to take the higher regulatory burden. Why? Because we have the same material, we have the same indication, but a different regulatory path. In the legs, for example, it's a 510K, whereas in the heart it's a PMA. The answer, quite simply, it's all based on risk. But remember, as we'll talk more about in a little while, risk has many different connotations. And in the classification webinar I have coming up next month that I mentioned before, I'm going to be talking in a lot more detail about risk, because classification and risk go hand in hand. You really cannot separate the two. So in this particular case, one of the things that I'm concerned about is my ability to mitigate regulatory risk. That is, to maximize the probability of successfully selling this strategy at the FDA. So bottom line, if something looks like a clamp and it acts like a clamp and it talks like a clamp. It could be a clamp, but it doesn't have to be a clamp. And that's the idea of this injectable medical device. If you know, an average regulatory person will see this injectable medical device and think injectable medical device, but a better regulatory person will see this injectable medical device and think hemostat. Discovery is seeing what everybody else has seen and thinking what nobody else has thought. So if you can develop the skill to look at one product like this and in your mind see another, that's a very valuable skill to have, especially when you're developing new and innovative regulatory strategies. And by the way, one of the reasons why, unfortunately, I had to non-dimensionalize this by not giving you the specific product, even though it is on the market, is because this is an example of what I call a proprietary regulatory strategy. And here's what I mean by that. Oftentimes when companies invite me to come in and help them bring a product onto the market in a new way, in an innovative way, in a way that has never been done before, they're not keen on me going out and telling the rest of the world exactly how I did it. So this is exactly why I call it a proprietary regulatory strategy. And I have asked many of my attorney friends if there is any way that I can protect a regulatory strategy in the intellectual property sense of the word. Nobody has been able to give me one yet. If anybody knows of one, please let me know. But I would love to be able to protect it. Okay, all of what we just said here, that is what we disclosed at the FDA. What I didn't disclose is the last tidbit. And here's where it gets really interesting. There are a lot of reasons why I do what I do. There are a lot of reasons why I design regulatory strategies the way I design them. I also said at FDA that when we go for the getting this product on the market, we're going to go for the 510K, the peripheral indication first. Of course, for us, because it's faster, it's easier. But that's not what I told them. I said it's lower risk for the patient, blah, blah, blah. And they said, okay, Mike, no problem. But then we'll go for the PMA later. Well, let's bring this onto the market first as a 510K. And then the question is, once the product is on the market for anything, people are going to start to use it for whatever they want. So why bother doing the PMA later? Get it onto the market first, in this particular case under the 510K, and then allow people to use it off-label everywhere else. Now, sometimes when I've said this publicly, people say, well, what happens when, somebody at FDA says, well, what happens when we get this onto the market from a peripheral indication and people start using it for the coronaries off-label? And I say, you know what? That's a great question. I have no control over that, because the simple reality is we can put anything that we want to on our product's label. More precisely, anything that we and the FDA can agree upon. Only use our product this way, never use our product that way. But the simple reality is once our product leaves our door, we have absolutely no control over how it's going to be used. None whatsoever. And unless and until we want to sit down and have an intelligent, honest dialogue about regulating off-label use, and by the way, I'm adamantly against FDA regulating the practice of medicine. That has disaster written all over it in every language. But unless and until we're going to sit down and have a dialogue about regulating off-label use, it is simply unfair to hold me to a standard that nobody else in the medical device industry, or for that matter in the drug or the biotech industry, is held to either. So there is a response to that question, and it's very easy to make it go away. Very interesting regulatory strategy. I apologize, this slide is a little hard to read, but this is the quote that I mentioned a moment ago. Discovery is seeing what everybody else has seen and thinking what nobody else has thought. This is one of my favorite quotes to share with R&D audiences and with clinical audiences, but it's also one of my favorite quotes to share with regulatory audiences, and here's why. Because with all due respect, if you read a regulation and understand it and follow it the way that the hundreds, if not thousands of other people before you have read it and understood it and follow it, then quite frankly anybody can do that and you provide absolutely no additional value. However, if you develop this skill to read this regulation and see in it some way to use it that nobody else has used it before, or do something with it that nobody else has done it before, that makes a very valuable skill to have. Not something that most people have. but I believe you can develop it, and one of the first steps in developing it is the conscious awareness of it. So continuing on, how does the 510K compare to the PMA? Well, here's some interesting statistics for you, and this is just as of last year. The number of 510Ks is showed up on the top there, the number of PMAs below it. Please note the difference in scale. Bottom line, over the last decade, the number of 510K submissions has outnumbered the number of PMA submissions by a factor of about 200 times. 200 times. Is that a good thing? Well, I'll leave that as a rhetorical question for right now. As I said a moment ago, clearly the 510K is the workhorse of the medical device industry, but the PMA is important as well. And when the FDA put out these two new guidances that I'll be talking about at the end of this webinar just a couple of months ago on the PMA, some folks in the medical device industry sort of beat up on FDA because they said, why are you putting additional resources into developing guidances that quite frankly only apply to a very small number of products and a small number of companies and people. Well, with all due respect, I think that the PMA is an important part of the universe. That's not to say that the 510K is not important either. But anyway, I think you know where I'm going with that. Okay, and more interesting to me is what % of submissions are kicked back upon first review. Well, again, if you look at the data over the last year for the 510K and for the PMA, approximately 70% of 510K and PMA submissions are rejected first time out of the box. 70% are rejected first time out of the box. I hear a lot of my regulatory colleagues say their goal is to get their 510K cleared or their PMA approved. That has never been my goal because, quite frankly, any monkey can do that. My goal is not just to get my 510K cleared or my PMA approved, but it's to get it cleared or approved first time out of the box, or if with the smallest number of ping pongs going back and forth with Q&A as possible. So how do you achieve that? Well, that's the topic of a different discussion, but in a nutshell, one of the philosophies I apply here is it's impossible to anticipate every problem or every question, but you can anticipate many of them. And many times people will ask me, well, Mike, you work as a consultant for FDA as well as Health Canada. If somebody came to FDA and asked this question, what would they say? How would they respond? More often than not, I turn the question right around on them. I simply say, well, put yourselves in the shoes of the FDA reviewer. If this submission was coming across your desk, what questions would you have? What concerns would you have? And so on and so on. Because let me let you in on a little secret. The FDA doesn't know any more or any less than any of you do. You went to the same schools, you go to the same meetings, you read the same journals. Yes, they might know a little bit more about your competitors' products, but on the other hand, you should know a heck of a lot more about your product than they do. So put yourselves in the shoes of the FDA reviewer. What would you need to see in terms of data, in terms of whatever, in order to sign off on this, saying that this product is okay to use in a family member or friend or perhaps even myself? That is the ultimate sniff test. So, again, my goal here is not to be in the 70 or 75%. My goal is to be in the 20%. Am I there all the time? No, but I am in there most of the time. Okay, and here's another case study that I thought I'd share with you a little bit. This is a device that came to the market just last year called the Melafine, and it's an interesting example of working in this gray area between the 510K and the PMA. For those of you that are not familiar with this particular product, let me share with you a short video from the news that's going to talk about it.
Cancer, and the American Academy of Dermatology says every hour one person in the U.S. will die from its deadliest form, melanoma. Tonight, CBS News' Lisa Siegel shows us how a new high-tech device could change those numbers.
You may wonder how technology used to defend our country to spot and target missiles has now been adapted to spot a dangerous target on our skin, melanoma. the deadliest form of skin cancer.
It took 11 years to develop and FDA approved the technology. Some of the brightest minds in the world worked on it because some of these people actually worked on the Star Wars project. They were rocket scientists.
The outcome, Melifind, a state-of-the-art instrument to spot potential skin cancer more advanced than any tool dermatologist Gene Rubenstein has ever used.
Melifind is a game changer, there's no doubt about it.
In his Studio City office, the doctor is examining Melinda Bentz. She's already had one mole removed and is now concerned about others.
I have a family history of skin cancer, so I want to make sure that everything's good.
The device takes a painless image of each mole, looking deep in the layers of the skin to give the doctor a 3D view. It will show him how irregular each mole is. Assign a number low to high. The higher the number, the more concern. Melifind actually compares each image to a database of almost 10,000 other images, eventually giving each mole a ranking and giving the doctor invaluable information. Now the doctor is concerned about 3 moles on Melinda, 1 on the leg.
It's a little asymmetric.
And 2 on the back.
And so I'm going to Melifind these 2 moles as well.
Watch as Melifind analyzes each mole layer by layer, eventually giving them a number.
We're going to know the obvious melanomas, but it's the ones that are in the gray area that we either decide to biopsy or not. This technology allows us an answer.
Melinda's mole on her leg didn't warrant a biopsy. Neither did one of the moles on her back. But the other one...
So this is one that I would definitely biopsy. With the naked eye, it doesn't really look like much. If you look at these 2 moles, they look identical. But this one turned out to be highly disorganized because we can see more under the skin.
So out of the 3 moles, Melinda only had to have 1 biopsied. Without Melifind, the doctor says he may have done more. Biopsies which can be unnecessary, painful, and costly.
It's an amazing tool.
Space-age technology that will hopefully save lives. I'm Lisa Siegel, CBS 2 News.
All right, so that's, pardon me, that's a device that recently came to the market, and we're going to use this as a case study to demonstrate why. By the way, it's an important point to note that in that video they said that this device does not diagnose skin cancer. Rather, it provides a numerical score, or as I like to say, it raises a red flag in an area of concern that is telling the doctor, okay, Mr. Doctor, Mr. Dermatologist, whoever you are, this area looks suspicious, look here further. The question is why? We could easily, from a technology perspective, have had this thing give us a diagnosis of malignant melanoma, the worst form of skin cancer, but we did not do that. Why? Very simple, because our regulatory risk would be much higher, and our regulatory burden, what we would have to show via clinical trials and so on, would be much higher. So how was this brought to market? Well, you can probably guess that because I'm talking about this case within the context of a PMA webinar, it was brought to market as a PMA, and in fact, it was. But if I told you that this device was brought to market as a PMA, what have you learned? Absolutely nothing. Because that's like telling you 1 + 1 = 2. But what happens tomorrow when somebody asks you what is 3 + 5, or 8 + 2, or 9 × 7, and so on and so on? So more important than the answer is what is the regulatory logic? How do you get there yourself? So if you were bringing this product onto the market, it would be tempting to want to bring this market under the 510K. And you could make a very strong case that this would be 510Kable for reasons I won't get into here. However, the regulatory risk is going to be higher. And one of the things that we have to take into account here, it's not because of lack of precedent, although this particular device is new. There are other kinds of cancer diagnostics and other kinds of medical devices that we could use as precedents. It's what I call an indirect precedent. But really, it all has to do with risk. Can we mitigate the risks sufficiently to get down to the level of the 510K via, in other words, Class 2 or even Class 1? In this particular case, we have to dig into risk just a tiny bit more. So when we talk about risk, we're talking about many different forms of risk. First kind of risk, and this is sort of the Drues approach to risk. You don't have to follow this approach if you don't want to, but this is an approach that I've developed over the years. It's a more systematic approach to risk as opposed to the cherry-picking approach that most people use. What is the risk of direct harm? That is, what is the risk of this particular product harming directly the patient? Well, here the risk is minimal at best. I would not say zero, because if you say zero, you're setting yourself up to getting smacked, because nothing ever happens 0% of the time or 100% of the time. But I would say very minimal. That risk is easy to mitigate. What is the risk of not using this product? That's the second type of risk that we have to use, that we have to consider. Well, the risk of not using this product basically is the status quo, because we've been practicing medicine for a very long time without this device. Therefore, if we did not have it, we would be back to the status quo. Once again, that risk is easy to mitigate. The third type of risk is the risk of providing the wrong information, and that's what gets us in trouble here, and this is why it went the PMA route. In other words, the risk of this particular product, this particular device, telling the patient they have cancer when in fact they do not, that's what we call a false positive, or the risk of this device telling the patient they do not have cancer when in fact they really do. That's a false negative. That last one, the false negative, is the most difficult form of risk to mitigate in this case, because basically what we're telling the patient and the doctor is they don't need to worry, they don't have cancer when in fact they really do. And again, it's really difficult to separate the regulation from the biology here without getting into a little bit about cancer and so on and so on. The reason why that risk is so difficult to mitigate is because nobody dies of cancer. It's impossible. What you die of is the cancer cells spreading or metastasizing to some other part of the body, like the brain or the lungs, and taking over the function of that particular part of the body. And when it comes to skin cancer, in this particular case, the indication for malignant melanoma, it's the least common form of skin cancer, but it is also the most deadly form of skin cancer, because those are the types of cells that really love to spread to other parts of the body, and that's what kills you. Once again, I wish we had more time to get into this, but to talk about regulation, in the absence of talking about the pathophysiology, I hear people try to do this all the time, but unfortunately it doesn't make any sense. Anyway, that's another example of risk in the context of in this case, a PMA. So there are a lot of regulatory consultants out there, but surprisingly very, very few good ones. It's kind of like saying, every surgeon has gone to medical school, but does that mean that every surgeon is equally as good? Of course not. And I teach medical school part-time as well, so believe me, I see this all the time. So how do you become a good one if you want to become a good one, or how do you look for a good one if you're looking to hire a good one? Very simple. Learn when to follow, but more importantly, learn when to lead. Now, don't get me wrong. If it's to my advantage to follow in somebody else's footsteps, then I will be the first one to do that. And when I go into FDA, I will put up on my PowerPoint slide in 72-point font, I'm do nothing more than following in somebody else's footsteps. But if it's not to my advantage to follow in somebody else's footsteps, or if it's not possible to follow in their footsteps, I will be the first to carve out my own path. Because if you want to lead the orchestra, you must first turn your back on the crowd. So learn when to follow, but more importantly, learn when to lead. Okay, continuing on, if you don't want to play in the PMA universe, how else can we mitigate risk? Well, I alluded to this earlier. Here is another view of risk. Don't worry about the labels on those axes, because I have to take those off. That's not really what I like. But if you just think about this as a risk continuum, not risk of device failure, but just a risk continuum. At the low end of the continuum, we have the exempt devices, then we get into the 510Ks, and then ultimately the PMAs. If you don't want to be in the PMA universe, you have to mitigate your risk to the point where justifying it, getting it into the 510K world, the Class 2 or the Class 1 realm. And that's where the de novo pathway fits in. Basically, the idea of the de novo is, let's take a simple example. If you're bringing a new medical device onto the market for the very first time, let's say a Band-Aid. Obviously, we have lots of Band-Aids around, but if you're bringing a Band-Aid onto the market for the first time, what is the default classification for that Band-Aid? Well, it's a no-brainer. The default classification is Class 3. Well, it should not take an MD or a Ph.D. or an RAC after somebody's name to understand that putting a Band-Aid in the Class 3 bucket it makes absolutely no sense just because it's new. In other words, we would be putting a Band-Aid in the same bucket as totally implantable artificial hearts, and that is absolutely nuts. So the de novo pathway is a pathway that allows us to, it's a form of down classification, it allows us to argue that the risk is not significant enough to justify doing a PMA, and we can lower it down to class 2, or maybe even class 1. That's the essence of the de novo, and the crux to a successful de novo submission is your risk mitigation strategy. I don't care if you've dotted all of your I's and crossed all your T's, if you do not have a very strong risk mitigation strategy, you will not be successful. And also, as we've talked a tiny bit about today, and I'll be talking more about in the classification webinar next month, there are a lot of different connotations of risk. We have to mitigate each and every one in order to be successful. Remember, there are not a lot of people that do this well. And here's another example, real quick, a device that was brought to market recently under the de novo. This is something called a pill cam, and the indication here is for patients that are not able to have a complete colonoscopy for reasons other than inadequate preparation. By the way, that indication was chosen specifically because of regulatory reasons. No other reasons, specifically because of regulatory reasons. Bottom line, how did we bring this onto the market de novo? We had to mitigate the risk. In this particular case, starting out with my big three, the risk of direct harm to the patient, or sometimes to the user or the operator. Well, the risk of direct harm, not zero, but very minimal, because it just passes through your body. The risk of not using the device, what other options? Well, they can do a traditional colonoscopy or a virtual colonoscopy, but go back to the indication. So we cannot use this product, at least in the initial labeling anyway. This is not, we're talking on-label use here, for reasons other than inadequate preparation. So they're not a candidate for traditional colonoscopy. So your regulatory strategy, your risk is directly related to your indication. Very easy to mitigate that risk. The third risk, providing the wrong information, which is endemic in all diagnostics, including this one, the risk of providing the wrong information. In other words, not finding a problem when there is a problem, or finding a problem when there is, in fact, not a problem. And that is the reason why we had to do a clinical trial of almost 900 patients, because we could not mitigate that particular risk sufficiently to get it completely out of the 510K world. Anyway, there are a lot of different types of risk, and we have to acknowledge and mitigate all of them in order to maximize the probability of success. And in a more formal fashion, this was just published in the Federal Register a few weeks ago on this particular product, and a more formal approach to risk. But there's really nothing on there that I don't include in my approach. This is just done in a slightly different way. If you want more, as I mentioned, I did a webinar for the Life Sciences Training Institute a few months ago on the de novo. Send me an email. I'll be happy to give you the information, to give you access to that. And I also did this two-part article in the Life Science Training Institute sister publication, Med Device Online, on the de novo pathway. As I said before, it's very uncommonly used in the past, but I think it has the potential to be used a lot more in the future. Okay, continuing on, let's get into some of the details of the PMA. First of all, if you want more on this kind of information, on FDA's website, one of my favorite sections to go is the CDRH learning section, and if you go there, you can click on the IDE process, and you can watch online tutorials that will specifically go into the details of the regulatory requirements. This is why when I do training like this, I prefer to take the case study approach as opposed to just reading to you the regulation, because you're all smart people. You all went to school. You can read the regulation yourself. You don't need me or anybody else to do it. And if you don't want to read it, you can click on one of these online videos and watch one of my friends at FDA basically read the regulation to you. There's useful information, no doubt, but they're not going to tell you, and this is not FDA's job to tell you how to best use the regulation. That's what I'm trying to emphasize here. So nonetheless, there are three types of PMA submissions, just like in the 510K world, we have three types. We have the traditional PMA, the modular, and the streamlined PMA. And very briefly, I'll talk about each one. First is the traditional. This is, in the medical device world, a pretty large submission, kind of akin to NDAs and BLAs that we use for drugs and biologics, certainly much more than a 510K for those that come from the 510K world. And the contents should include the description of the device, the intended use, and let me talk just about intended use a tiny bit. This is a very common phrase that a lot of people use, but in my opinion, most people really do not understand what it means. They think they understand it, but they really don't. A lot of people think that intended use means using your product. Does your product do... I'm sorry, let me say it this way. A lot of people think that intended use means how could your product be used. That is not what intended use means. A lot of people think that it's about what your product is designed to be used for. Once again, that is not what intended use means. Intended use is directly related to your label claim. Intended use means, very simply, what do you say that your product should be used for? Not what it's designed to be used, not what it could be used for, but what you say it's to be used for. And in the world of label claims, I break that world into two different types. Stated claims versus inferred or implied label claims. A stated label claim is a claim that you put on your label in black and white, and therefore you need to prove it in terms of benchtop testing, animal testing, clinical testing, whatever it is. An inferred or an implied label claim is something that you do not put on your label, at least not in black and white, but that everybody knows that this thing can be used for this anyway, whether you say it or not. The beauty about using inferred or implied label claims is you don't have to prove them. So in a sort of way, it's kind of like off-label use, but not really. This is why I often say in my regulatory presentations, average regulatory folks know what to say, better regulatory folks know what not to say, and the best regulatory folks know how to take advantage of what they do not say. Let me say that one more time. Average regulatory folks know what to say, and there are a lot of those. Better regulatory folks know what not to say. The best regulatory folks, and there are not that many, the best regulatory folks know how to take advantage of what they do not say. There are so many shades of gray to this that that's what makes it fun, I think. Anyway, in addition to that, we need to have our non-clinical and clinical studies, if that's applicable. Again, most PMAs require clinical data, some do not. And if you're going to require clinical data, your clinical trial report forms, your manufacturing methods. Now, for those of you that are coming from the 510K world, this is going to be new to you, because in the 510K universe, we are not required to put manufacturing information in the 510K submission. Although that may be changing in the future, and here's why. I can't say anything definitive, but I can tell you that we have had several discussions at FDA about adding this requirement into the 510K. Why? Simple. Because the medical devices that we're using, even in the 510K world, are becoming more and more complicated. And to separate the design of the device from the manufacturing method used to make the device, in my opinion, really makes no sense. So we don't have a requirement in the 510K world now for manufacturing methods like there is in the PMA, but we may in the future. Don't be surprised if that comes. I'm not talking about in the next 2 days or the next week, but at some point in the not too distant future. And by the way, this is a direct result from what's happening in the drug and especially the biotech world. Of course, when we require manufacturing methods and manufacturing procedures and so on, what level of detail is required? Well, that's up to us, right? I have a colleague of mine in a company who showed me once what he's including in his regulatory submissions under manufacturing methods, and it's a one-page flow chart. Basically, say the materials come in, we do some stuff to it, and it comes out as a final product. And so, yeah, technically they're meeting that regulatory requirement, but how well they're meeting it, that's up to them. Regulation is often very non-specific, and this is one of many examples of that. To a lot of people, that's bothersome. To me, that's a huge advantage, because the more nebulous, the more vague the more ambiguous the regulation, or indeed, I like to work in areas where there's no regulation or very little at all, because that affords me the wiggle room to do what I think needs to be done. In other words, if I'm working in an area where there's a lot of very specific regulation and I want to do something different, now I have to argue that, what they did before me was not appropriate and what I want to do is better. I've been successful both ways, but given a choice, I'd much prefer to not have the baggage of going in a more specific area. And, of course, your labeling. I had one of the companies that I'm working with right now, it's a medical device company that's in the midst of a clinical trial, and they're having problems with the clinical trials, and long story short, the reason why is because they did not have a definitive conversation about what their labeling should be prior to beginning the clinical trial. Well, to me, that has disaster written all over it in every language. You should never do a clinical trial before you know very specifically what you want your labeling to be, because that, in fact, is the purpose of the trial. It's not to show that your product is safe and effective like a lot of other people think. It's simply to establish your product's label. And if you don't know what's going to be on your label when you begin, you're setting yourselves up for problems. Many of the problems that we face could be avoided. I can't tell you how many times a company invites me to come in and help them get out of a particular problem, whether it's either in development or when the product is on the market. And I say to them, sure, I'm happy to help. But I also, have to tell you that if you would have called me 6 months ago or 18 months ago, maybe we would not be in this situation. All right, so that's the traditional PMA, and that's submitted basically as a single package. The next option, and this is my favorite option, is the modular PMA. As its name implies, this consists of modules. For those of you that remember the encyclopedia, think of each volume of the encyclopedia. So there's a preclinical part, there's a clinical part, a manufacturing part, and so on and so on. And so it's made of each of these volumes, and each of these modules is submitted for review as it's completed. One of the frustrations that I've had in the medical device world, especially in the PMA world for a long time, is in some PMA products, the timelines can be very long. Like, for example, left ventricular assist devices. In Baxter's first LVAD, that particular device was under development for about 26 years. Well, why do I have to wait until year 26 to find out that there was a problem that happened back in year 2? That makes absolutely no sense. So why not be able to submit these modules as we sort of complete them? The preclinical part, we submit that. Then the clinical part, we submit that, and so on and so on. Now, there are advantages and disadvantages to everything. On the flip side, some people would argue that, well, when you submit one module at a time, you are by definition not telling the whole picture, and of course it's going to be biased. Well, that's true. But on the other hand, I think that there's advantages to submitting this one at a time, not the least of which is it's more efficient. Not that it saves time, because time is not the important thing to me. It's the efficiency that's the important thing to me. It's a more efficient process. As I said, why do I have to wait until year 26 to find out there was a problem in year 2? It makes absolutely no sense. And when you think about it, this is really the status quo anyway, because even when you submit a traditional PMA, it's going to get chunked up by FDA. The preclinical section is going to be sent to one group. The clinical section is going to be sent to another group, and so on and so on. So the modular approach really is not any different than what we do with the traditional approach. It's just a much more efficient way to use it. The process begins by creating what we call a PMA shell. This is nothing more than an outline or a table of contents. Basically, you do this at the very beginning to make sure that you identify all of these different pieces. You reserve a space, if you will, in your submission for each of these pieces. And then, as I said, FDA will review each of these modules as it is received. So for a whole bunch of reasons, not just the one or two I mentioned, the modular PMA approach is my favorite approach. It's not the most commonly used. The traditional is the most commonly used. If you have a PMA product that's going to be developed in a year or two, perhaps the modular approach is not as significant of an advantage, although I still like it in those cases. But if you have a very long-term project that's going to go many years, maybe even decades, I definitely like the modular approach better. And the third type is the streamlined PMA. This used to be a pilot program. I wouldn't really call it a pilot program anymore. But the important thing here is it's essentially a traditional PMA. There's no difference. The only difference is the streamlining is in the review process only. So basically, FDA will take a more expedited sort of approach. This is not expedited review. This is not fast tracking as we have on the drug side of the world, but it's something kind of equivalent. If you're familiar with the abbreviated 510K, it's a little bit like that because in the PMA universe, we're relying on an existing guidance document or some other consensus standard or some review history of similar products. And so that's the idea of an abbreviated 510K. If you're familiar with the abbreviated 510K, which only about 4% of 510Ks are brought to market as an abbreviated 510K, in the 510K world, if I can bring a device onto the market using the abbreviated 510K, it is without a doubt my first choice. Hands down, without a doubt. Why? Because it is the least burdensome of the least burdensome choices. The 510K is clearly the least burdensome of the major pathways to market that we discussed, and the abbreviated 510K is the least burdensome of the least burdensome. So the streamlined PMA, it's not applicable for all products, but bottom line, if this is something that you can fit yourself into, then by all means you should consider it. But make sure that you check in advance or talk to me. I'll be happy to talk to you about that. All right. So in a little more specific detail, before we wrap this up, what goes into the PMA? Well, much to some people's chagrin, there is no pre-printed application form, and in my opinion, that's a good thing because I want the freedom to be able to design my regulatory submission, just like I was going to design any other medical device or any other widget, in terms of choosing the format, choosing how I present that information, in terms of table form, pie chart, and so on, determining what I want to say and how I want to say it, what I do not want to say and how I do not want to say it, and so on and so on. I view that process, what I call regulatory submission design, very differently than a lot of other folks. I never hear anybody else talking about regulatory submission design. But in my opinion, that is one of the most important factors, perhaps the most important factor, in getting your 510K cleared or your PMA approved first time out of the box. Bottom line, and coincidentally, I'm going to be doing a webinar on communication with FDA in a month or so. I'll talk about this a bit more. But when it comes to designing a regulatory submission, there's the subtitle of a book that I like. It's not what you say that matters, it's what people hear. And that is all about regulatory affairs. It is not what you say that matters, it's what people hear. So I want the freedom to be able to design this thing the way I want to. I'll give you a real quick example. This is a company that I'm working with right now. They asked me to help them with their risk management plan, their risk mitigation strategy as part of their particular submission. And there were a few things on that risk plan that we identified that we really didn't want to draw attention to. And so the question is, how do we present that information? Well, one way that people present risk is from highest to lowest. In other words, the highest risk followed by the next and ultimately to the lowest. But you see, if there are risks on there that we do not want to draw attention to, then that's going to draw attention to them. Another way that we can present that risk information is in sort of a random way. In other words, just sort of a piecemeal approach. And that way we will not draw attention to the risks that we do not want to draw attention to. I'm not saying cover them up. I'm not saying that not include them, because we do have to include them. The regulation says we have to include them, but the regulation does not say that we have to draw attention to them. I see so many times people, they assume that the regulation says something when in fact it really doesn't. And to take that even further, I actually advise the company to go a step further and let's list a heck of a lot more risks than we probably need to. Nobody could ever fault you for giving too much information. But once again, it is a way of not drawing attention to the risks that we don't want to draw attention to. So bottom line, I view the fact that we don't have pre-printed forms and specific guidance as a huge advantage, but not everybody does. Unless an omission is justified, you need to include all of these pieces. And let me take that a step further. In any of your regulatory submissions, including the PMA, don't leave anything out. Because put yourself in the shoes of whoever is on the other side of the table. If there's a section that is missing, how does the person on the other side of the table know why it's missing? In other words, is it missing because it's not applicable, because you thought about it and it doesn't apply, or is it missing because you just forgot about it? So the most common reason why submissions are rejected on administrative review, and there are two parts of the review process, the administrative review, which is first, and the scientific review part, which is second. The most common reason why submissions are rejected on an administrative review, remember I said earlier, more than 70% of submissions are rejected first time out of the box, is because something is missing. So if something is not appropriate, or not applicable, or not possible, or whatever it is, don't just leave it out. Say that it's not applicable. And I actually advise the companies that I work with to take it a step further. Don't just say that it's not applicable. Offer a couple of sentences. It doesn't have to be 10 pages, but a couple of sentences, maybe a paragraph, on why it's not applicable. Make it painfully obvious to anybody sitting on the other side of the table that you have not forgot about it, but rather you don't think it's applicable, and here's why. Remember, anybody can get a submission cleared or a PMA approved. I want to be able to get it approved the first time out of the box if possible. And am I successful 100% of the time? Absolutely not. But I am successful much more often than most other people because of some of the tips that I'm sharing with you today. 6 copies of the PMA are required. Now, again, a lot of people would say, well, this is just simply an artifact of ancient history when people were doing things, by paper as opposed to electronically. And they would argue that we should take that out of the regulation. Well, to me, I don't think it needs to be taken out of the regulation, and here's why. Because it reiterates in my mind that when they're asking for 6 copies, that means that this is big, that this is important, that's going to be sent to many different people. And so as a result, it emphasizes that the complex nature of it. And some people say, with regard to electronic submissions today, people have asked me, well, does that mean that I need to submit 6 different PDF files of the same thing? Of course not. I mean, only an idiot would do that. Maybe somebody might, I don't know. But anyway, that's not the point. But let me talk just a tiny bit about electronic submissions. I see more and more electronic submissions being made in the device world, which is great. We're still light years behind the drug world when it comes to electronic submissions, but we're making progress. But what frustrates me is the number of people that are submitting documents electronically, but they're not taking advantage of any of the bells and whistles that electronic documents offer us. So, for example, if you look up in that slide, table of contents. Well, if you're submitting a electronic document with a table of contents where you are not hyperlinking each and every item in your table of contents to the appropriate section in your submission, so that somebody, if they're interested in the clinical section in the table of contents, they can click on it, boom, it takes you right there, then you are not taking advantage of the bells and whistles that electronic documents offer. And further, I see in a lot of submissions, including especially PMA submissions, where people refer to some sort of a consensus standard, an ASTM testing standard, or something like that. Well, when I'm reviewing these submissions, if it's been a long time since I've reviewed that standard, or maybe I'm not familiar with it at all, if you just simply refer to me to that standard, and then it takes 20 minutes of my time for me to track that standard down and to read it, I'm not saying that I'm going to go so far as to, make your life a living you-know-what because you cost me that 20 minutes. But what I am suggesting is this. The easier that you can make the job of the reviewer, the better it's going to be for you. So don't just refer to some esoteric standard that somebody may or may not have ever read. Say, here's where the standard, and oh, by the way, if you're interested in this standard, click on this link, and boom, it takes you right there. Once again, this is not rocket science, but it's amazing to me how so few people do this. And when it comes to product information, and a couple of the other coming slides, it'll talk about product information. Why not include a picture of your product? A picture's worth 1,000 words. Well, better yet, why not include a video of your product? A video is worth 1,000 pictures. I had somebody recently, when they submitted a PMA on a thumb drive, they included some videos with it along with my suggestion. And of course, and unfortunately, when FDA got it, they couldn't get it through their IT system because it wasn't capable of those file sizes. Yada yada. Okay, don't get me started on the IT limitations of dealing with the government or large institutions like companies. But that's a solvable problem. If you want to provide a video, just simply put it on your website or point to a publicly available video on YouTube or something like that and say, hey, if you're interested in seeing how our product works, click on this hyperlink from the submission and it takes you right to the video. If you're concerned about confidential information, or for example advertising a product that's not on the market yet, that's a solvable problem. Put the video on your company's website, password protect it, and say to the reviewer, if you want to see the product in action, click on this hyperlink, and oh, by the way, type the password ABC123. These are all solvable problems. Furthermore, it fascinates me how so many people think that the FDA is an expert in whatever area that they're working in. In other words, if you're bringing a product onto the market for diabetes, that the person on the other side of the table is an expert on diabetes. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. So why not provide a couple of very short videos, maybe I like 3 to 5 minute videos, publicly available videos, that basically say, this product is on insulin-dependent diabetes mellitus, IDDM, so-called type 1 diabetes. If you're not real familiar with IDDM, click on this YouTube video and it'll give you a short primer on this particular disease. Once again, I find it interesting how so few people do this, in part because maybe the regulation doesn't require them to do it. And again, this is all stuff that I'm going to be talking about in the communication webinar coming up in next month. So in addition to all of that, we have the indications for use, we have the device description. Once again, this is very easy to say, but the devil's in the details. I had a company that I'm working with right now. They had a submission kickback because they included specifications for the particular device, which is what the regulation says, but apparently they did not include certain specifications. They included some specifications, but not other specifications. So which do you include and which do you not? This is not simple stuff. The manufacturing process I included and so on. Alternative practices and procedures. Once again, for those of you that come from the 510K world, this is not in the 510K universe. It is a PMA universe thing, and it comes from the drug world. We need to include what other medical devices and what other procedures are available to the patient if they don't use yours. Simply put, the reason it's not enough to understand what the regulation says. We have to understand why it's there. The reason is very simple: risk. The risk, remember, one of the risks that I talked about before in my approach to risk is the risk of not using your particular device. Well, that's what this regulatory requirement speaks to. The risk of not using your device. In other words, what other alternative practices and procedures. And when it gets interesting, if you're working on a medical device for hypertension, for example, what about the litany of drugs that are out there? We have more than 170 drugs on the market in the United States that have as their part of their label antihypertensive. Do we list all of the drugs if we're coming out with a PMA device that's going to go after hypertension, or do we list only some of the drugs? So again, the regulation is very nebulous, and I see that as an advantage. Okay, continuing on, marketing history. We want to know how we got to where we are, not just here in the United States, but in other parts of the world as well. And also, and I've seen a couple of companies get in trouble for this before, even if the same device is being used for other indications under a 510K, remember the Magoo example that I shared with you earlier, you have to include it here if it's the same device but a different intended use. Of course, now you get into the argument of, well, what does the same device mean? If you tweak the device a little bit, for example, if you do something as seemingly simple as changing the color of the device, could you get around this regulatory requirement because it's no longer the same device? I'll leave that as a rhetorical question, but some of you might laugh when I say that, but it's not nearly as hypothetical as some people think. You need to have a summary of your clinical data, if you did have clinical data, as well as the non-clinical, the testing data. You need to have the conclusions from those. Again, I'm going to skip past a lot of this verbiage because you can read a lot of that, and if you want, you can, follow up with me on specific questions. I'd be more than happy to help however I can. Then you start to put together the summary section, which eventually will form the summary of safety and efficacy data, or SAID document, that not just we're starting to use more here in the United States, but places in other parts of the world are using a similar format as well. That's an important document. A description of these different things. Again, I'm gonna skip through some of those, but if you have questions, feel free to contact me. References to any performance or voluntary standards. This is especially important in the streamlined PMA, very similar to the abbreviated 510K. So if you have experience with that, it's basically the same thing, only applied to a PMA. The technical data and information in enough detail to permit FDA to determine whether to approve or deny. But what the heck does enough detail mean? Again, the devil's in the details, pardon the pun. Again, you have to use your own professional judgment. The regulation will not tell us, and in my opinion, it should not tell us how much detail to provide. Because how can you possibly have regulation that on one hand is broad enough to cover the vast universe of medical devices, but on the other hand, that is specific enough to be able to be useful for somebody that's developing a left ventricular assist device or a mobile medical app or an in vitro diagnostic or something like that. So we need to use our professional judgment in order to answer questions like, what is sufficient detail? And again, my best advice, and some people do not like this advice, but it's my best advice, put yourself in the shoes of the reviewer. If this came across your desk, what would you want to see, what data, and so on, in order to sign off to say that this is okay to use for a family member or a friend or perhaps even myself. Now, in the vast number of companies that I've worked with in the 20-plus years I've been playing this game, companies take different approaches. Some companies only want to include in their regulatory submission only what they have to include and not one bit more, because they would argue that anything more, anything above and beyond, is opening up the possibility to getting a question and creating a problem where none existed. And I understand that. On the flip side, some companies will take the approach of, well, let's give them everything we possibly can to sort of cover our own you-know-what, so to speak. But also in the risk presentation of the risk plan example I shared with you earlier, sometimes providing a lot more information is a strategy that some of us use. Many don't like to admit it, but some of us do use in order to, I don't want to say hide, because it's not a matter of hiding, but not drawing attention to information that we don't want to draw attention to. Again, if clinical studies were involved, you need to follow the good clinical practice guidelines as outlined in these sections of the CFR. In addition to that, if you have a single investigator submission, and this is very high-risk regulatory strategy, I do not recommend this in most cases, but in some cases it's done. You need to have a justification for why. You need to include a bibliography. You need to include all of this other stuff. Again, I'm going to go through this very quickly. Why not include not just pictures or videos? Why not even samples of your device? If it's feasible, if you're making a stent, for example, it'd be easy to send in a stent. If you're making an MRI machine, maybe not so easy. And actually, why limit it yourself to submitting one of your devices? Why not submit one of your competitors' devices as well? As you can imagine, a lot of companies are not keen on this, but in the 510K world, if you are making your case that your device is substantially equivalent and the pushability or the torqueability of your catheter is substantially equivalent to your competitor's catheter, why, instead of just giving them a table of how the numbers compare from your Instron testing machine or whatever it is, why not give them the two catheters and let them push on them side by side? Again, that's another approach that some people take. Environmental piece has to be in there as well. Now, some people, let me talk about that for just a second. Some people say, well, gee, why would FDA care if this is if there's an environmental hazard? Well, here's the short take on it. If you're using a nasty chemical in your manufacturing process to make your medical device, and that nasty chemical gets out into the universe and causes harm to the forest or the trees or something, FDA could care less. I don't mean I don't mean to be overly flippant, but that's not their concern. EPA's concern is that. On the other hand, if your nasty chemical injures one of the manufacturing technicians, the employees in your facility, once again, FDA could care less. That's an OSHA thing. However, if that nasty chemical stays in your device and then can become a leachable or an extractable when it goes into one of your patients, now FDA gets involved. So environmental assessment is a very interesting area because depending on the ramifications, it could be EPA, it could be OSHA, it could be FDA. And so those are all things that we have to take into account. Wrapping this up because we're almost out of time. We've talked about omissions already. You need to also provide updates as more and more information becomes available. How often you provide an update, that's up to you. There is a cover sheet which you can use if you want to. You don't have to. But if it's going to help you act as a checklist, then by all means use it. There's a cover letter you could use. I would like to think we're all professionals. We know how to write a business letter, but if you were asleep that day when they taught that in school, then use one of the cover letters. And getting it even more, I mean, the regulation still has in nauseating detail, use a paper of a certain size and margins and so on. I mean, let's get real. Do any of us really need this level of detail? Some people do. A friend of mine at a recent one of the MD&M conferences, she was she's the head of the 510K program at FDA, a good friend of mine, and she made the comment that to remember to put page numbers on your 510K submissions. And I asked her in the public Q&A section after, because I wanted this question to be on the record, I said, with all due respect, do we need anybody, let alone the government, telling us to put page numbers and put our names on our papers? Well, she said, Mike, and she and I go back for a long time. She agrees with me 100%, but you would be surprised how many people do not do that. So maybe that's an indictment of the American educational system. I don't know, but this should be a no-brainer for I think all of you. The summary of safety and effectiveness data, the said document, as I said, FDA is now required as part of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act to put that together. It's originally written by the manufacturer, but FDA can rewrite it if they have to. And in my opinion, that that should never happen. You need to write that because you need to control the spin on that. You don't want somebody else writing that for you. And here are the common pieces that go into the set. And from an international regulatory perspective, most of those pieces, actually, in fact, all of those pieces, can be recycled, or to use a drug metaphor, repurposed for other places, for other parts of the world. And this is the topic of a much more advanced discussion when it comes to international regulatory submissions and international regulatory strategies. But for the most part, all of the information that we are collecting in the U.S. versus the EU versus some other place of the world, it should for the most part be the same thing. Maybe the way that we put it together in terms of packaging it and so on, that might be a little different, but it should be the same thing. And if it's not, then we have to ask why. So in terms of a review, there is a statistical checklist which you can use if you want. There's a review checklist. Again, if you want examples, you can contact me, or if you have specific questions. Hopefully by now you've had enough of the regulatory minutia. That's why I like to spend more time on the case studies. Bottom line, don't just follow the rules. Think. Here's one of my favorite quotes from Douglas MacArthur, who said, "Rules are mostly made to be broken and are too often for the lazy to hide behind." You can imagine how the response that I get when I show that particular slide at a RAPS conference, the Regulatory Affairs Professional Society. Many people throw things at me, which I would argue is a good thing, because at least I know their people are staying awake. So if the rules make sense, then by all means follow them. But if the rules don't make sense, and we all agree that they don't make sense, and yet they follow them anyway, is that a problem with the system, or is that a problem with us? So don't just follow the rules, think. What's possible? For any of you that are Doogie Howser fans, let me share with you this short video, and then we're going to wrap things up.
my life, I have dared to go past what is possible.
To the impossible?
Actually, past that. To the place where the possible and the impossible meet to become the possimpable. If I can leave you with one thought, it's this. Nothing and everything is possimpable.
I love that. Thank you, Doogie Howser. Nothing and everything is possimpable. And so just to wrap this up with the last question that I want to talk about for just a couple of minutes, and then we'll be out of time, is what's new in the PMA world. Of course, regulation, if regulation is a science, and that's a debatable topic in and of itself, but if regulation is a science, I would like to think that it's an evolutionary science that's constantly evolving, kind of like, what we are supposed to do in the design controls. Our outputs become our inputs, which, by the way, is not unique to regulation. I mean, anybody that knows anything about biology has been doing this for millions of years. If you know something about endocrinology or neurology, it's feedback. Your outputs become your inputs. So this is a constantly evolving process, and FDA just recently has put out a couple of new guidance documents, both in the area of the PMA. There's a lot of similarities between the two. Here's one, and I've included both of these in your handouts and resources section that go along as part of this webinar course. Balancing pre-market and post-market data collection for devices for PMA. This is for all PMA devices, and basically it tries to outline the types of clinical data that should be submitted prior to marketing approval and after the product is on the market. So this is both pre-market as well as post-market. This is meant to address the balancing act, as I like to call it, between the need for safety and efficacy versus the need for patients to have access to timely new medical therapies. And this is not easy to achieve. This is actually, in fact, very, very difficult to do in reality. It's one thing to talk about how many people are harmed or perhaps even killed because they use a medical device that's on the market that in hindsight is not as safe or effective as it should be. Okay, that's easy to measure. What is more difficult to measure is how do we measure the number of people that are harmed or killed because they don't have access to a particular medical device, because a company like the ones that you folks work in right now choose not to bring that product onto the market because we have raised the regulatory burden to the point where the company simply says, gee, it's just not worth it for us to do this, or it's not worth it to do it here in the United States, and we'll do it somewhere else. So this balance, if you will, between, on one hand, safety and efficacy versus, on the other hand, the need to have these devices in a timely fashion is not an easy one. It's a topic that I've spoken on many times, the balance between regulation and innovation. Many people think that regulation and innovation are diametrically opposed. In other words, the more regulation that we have, the less innovation. I understand why many people think this, but it doesn't have to be that way. I think it's possible, and this is beyond the scope of our discussion today, it's possible to have really great innovation and decent regulation at the same time, but the solution is not to have more regulation because we already have thousands and thousands of pages of that. The solution is to get people to think. And that's not such an easy thing to do. And based on some of the columns that I've written in the last year, I'm a contributing editor to 3 of the largest medical technology publications in the world. That actually got me invited a few months ago to give a presentation on this very topic on Capitol Hill. And actually they just invited me to come back a second time to do something similar. Very interesting stuff. So anyway, this is all related to that balance. Typically, we need to have data from at least one clinical investigation, usually more. Bottom line, and this is a direct quote from that guidance, there is never 100% certainty when it comes to determining reasonable assurance of safety and efficacy of a device. And by the way, the reason why I underline the word reasonable there is because that is one of the most important differences, arguably the most important difference between the world of medical devices, which is something that most of you are probably familiar with, as opposed to the world of drugs and biologics. In the medical device world, we require require reasonable evidence of safety and efficacy. In the drug world and in the biologic world, we require substantial evidence of safety and efficacy. If you think the difference between those two words, reasonable and substantial, is nothing more than a matter of semantics, then with all due respect, you really don't understand the world in which we live, because that is precisely the reason why, as a general rule, drugs and biologics are much more difficult, much more challenging to get onto the market than medical devices. Is even not, especially the 510K devices, but even the PMA devices. The time and cost that it would take to obtain close to 100% certainty, when the heck do we ever have 100% of anything other than death and taxes, would be prohibitive, both to companies as well as to patients waiting for these new therapies. So that's the one of the two new guidances. The second new guidance that came out just 2 months ago is the Expedited Access Premarket Approval, or EAP, program. This is kind of a continuation of the Medical Devices Innovation Pathway that went into effect a couple of years ago to fast-track innovative devices. And if you're interested in this area, you really need to check the definition of innovative, because one of the limitations of this program originally was they would only accept 5 devices per year into this program. So this is not for Me Too products. Even if you're coming out with another PMA device like a stent, we've already got a whole bunch of them. Not a Me Too. This has got to be innovative by whatever definition of innovative. And again, this is to help patients have a more timely access to medical devices by expediting their development, assessment, and review, while preserving the statutory standard of reasonable assurance of safety and efficacy, which is a medical device requirement, not a drug requirement. In order to do this, you have to develop what we call a data development plan. That basically it outlines the data that you're going to need to collect as part of the development process and in the clinical trials and so on, and what other data can you collect post-market. In the drug world, it's what we call post-market surveillance, or phase 4. In the medical device world, it's what we call post-approval studies. And this is a key aspect to this particular program. Again, getting to the right balance is not an easy thing to do. Okay, so to wrap this up, we've talked about a number of different things in terms of how the PMA fits into the medical device world. Do we need to choose a single regulatory pathway? How does the 510K compare? What if we don't want to play in the PMA universe? What types of PMA exist? Some of the information that goes into the PMA, what's new in the PMA world. And just to kind of offer a few final thoughts to put a nice bow and so on at the end of this in a nice package. Michelangelo, very smart guy, not just a great artist, but a terrific philosopher, said the greatest danger for most of us is not that our aim is too high and we miss it, but rather that it's too low and we reach it. So where are we as individuals aiming? Where are we as organizations aiming? Where are we as an industry aiming? Indeed, where even as a society are we aiming? I'll leave that as a rhetorical question. If we want to take inspiration, why not take inspiration from one of the best? I steal from Albert Einstein and from Stephen Covey and so on, because these are all much smarter than me. Well, here's another, Steve Jobs, who arguably changed our world in some very profound ways, not just in evolutionary ways, but revolutionary ways. I'd like to end this webinar today with an example of one of his very first Apple computer ads from years ago, where he talked about what he called the crazy ones. Watch this.
Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them. About the only thing you can't do is ignore them. Because they change things. They push the human race forward. While some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius. Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do.
So call me naive, and certainly many people have, but I'm trying to change the world. I'm trying to make the world a better place, one person at a time. It's not easy. It's taking a long time, and sometimes it gets pretty lonely, but that's what I'm trying to do. And the last quote that I would want to share with you today, and then I'm happy to take a few questions if there are any, is imagine where we could be if discontent for the status quo was the norm rather than the exception. Imagine where we could be if discontent for the status quo was the norm rather than the exception. Who said that? Well, actually, I did in my first medical device book a number of years ago. So I want to just thank everybody for their attention. If you have questions after this webinar is over, feel free to contact me. I'm happy to help however you can. If you're interested in any of the other webinars that I mentioned, either in the past or the ones that are coming up, I'll be happy to give you information on those. I know we're just about out of time, but I'm happy to stick around for a few minutes if people have questions.